Many, many thanks and welcome to the Center for Global Development. I'm Amanda Glassman. I'm the Chief Operating Officer and a Senior Fellow here. In 2013, the Center ran a working group on development impact bonds with social finance, a group that had developed the now iconic social impact bond in the UK to reduce recidivism. That report argued that development impact bonds, or DIBs, could increase the efficiency and effectiveness of development funding by creating a contract between private investors and donors or governments around a shared development goal. Investors would pay in advance for interventions to reach the goals and are remunerated if the interventions succeed. Returns on the investment are linked to independently verified progress. This is an idea that we love at the Center for Global Development, and we've been talking about in one form or another since the organization began. Unlike a SIB, a social impact bond, a DIB does not pay back its upfront investors with savings that are realized because of the intervention. That was because the group recognized that in many cases, service delivery was not happening and that most of the costs were being incurred by households and people themselves. So there were no savings to be realized necessarily. And instead, a DIBs outcome funder is a donor, a philanthropist, or a government that uses its grant resources to pay out returns based on results achieved. So fast forward 5 years since this working group to today, and we're so proud to welcome the members of the coalition that have put together what I believe is the fourth development impact bond on record, the Cameroon Cataract Development Impact Loan, or Cataract bond for short. It is the very first DIB to include a development finance institution as an upfront investor, and I'm proud that it's a U.S. DFI, the U.S. Overseas Private Investment Corporation. And this coalition is special in another way, too. They were really willing to be transparent about the good, the tough, the ugly in the development process of the DIB, and they allowed and enabled us at the Center for Global Development to extract lessons and share the paper that we released today. Today we're going to hear directly about all the stuff that's in that paper and much more. I had the pleasure of sharing lunch with some of the members of the coalition, and I think it will make for a terrific event. I think we're just coming off of Davos when everyone's talking about impact investment. But I think there's a lot of talk, and these people are actually walking the talk. So that's an exciting place to be, especially if you work for a think tank. So we're going to kick off with remarks from David Bohigian, who's the Executive Vice President of OPIC, and Peter Longhorn, the President and CEO of the Conrad and Hilton Foundation. We'll follow that with a kind of fireside chat that will be moderated by Adva Saldinger, who's an associate editor at DEVIX. We have the bios of all of our participants today are listed out here, so I won't go through all of their qualifications. Trust me, they are an impressive bunch of people. After that, we'll have a presentation from Dr. Tamer Macri, who's the Vice President of Fundraising and Partnerships, Africa Eye Foundation, and he'll talk a little bit about the new hospital that's really at the center of this coalition's work. And we'll then have a panel discussion with more of the coalition members. And we'll have Q&A with you as well. So let's get started with our keynotes. I'll welcome David first. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Amanda. It is great to be back at the Center for Global Development. It's one of my first stops when I was nominated to work at the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. I've read all your work, Ben, and Todd as well, and the open letter to OPIC management was particularly helpful as we moved on, as is your report today. So thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. I had a chance to visit the eye clinic in Cameroon just earlier this month. And when I opened my remarks, I quoted Sir Isaac Newton, who said, "If I've seen further, it's because I stand on the shoulders of giants." So the first thing that I wanted to do while we celebrate Sight today is thank some of the giants who are in this room who have helped make this possible. First, I wanted to thank Peter from the Hilton Foundation. Fantastic visionary work by the foundation. Tomer, thank you and the foundation. What we've seen there and your plans to make this happen around the world are absolutely fantastic. I want to thank Dia Martin at OPIC who made this a reality. And again, everyone in this room, I hope, will play a part in hearing what we have to say today about this is not just a model for sight. This is not just a model for Cameroon. It's not just a model for Africa. It's a model for the world. Development impact bonds and blended finance, I think, can play a more important role for development in the 21st century than any other force. When you have the private sector and the public sector come together to look at outcomes in a way that's absolutely unique, it's going to lead the way to better outcomes throughout the world. And I know that because I've had a chance to visit some of OPIC's projects around the world. I've been seeking the answer to the question, how can capital unlock human potential? And I saw that when I went to Cameroon. When I was there at the clinic, I had a chance to visit with one of the patients. And he had been blind for over 10 years. And his family and his friends had begged him to get treatment that was not available before the clinic was open. One of his friends picked him up on a bicycle, took him to the clinic. He was cured, and his family said, "Welcome back to life," after he was cured. It's that kind of transformative work that we can do on the ground, working together with this coalition and taking it more broadly. OPIC's been working in impact investing to advance U.S. foreign policy for almost 50 years. And the development goals today are something that we're committed to. So I look forward to working with this coalition, working with everyone in this room to continue that tradition of ensuring that the world enjoys the prosperity and freedom that we've grown accustomed to. So thank you very much. Peter?
Thank you, David, and good afternoon, everyone. Conrad Hilton was both a warm-hearted humanitarian and the businessman who conducted the largest real estate deal in history up to his time. And we at the Hilton Foundation strive to embody both of those characteristics. Our mission is the alleviation of human suffering, which is not eminently quantifiable. But we also try to be businesslike in terms of the scale and scalability of what we do, be collaborative, and look for new financing opportunities. We also try to have a strong learning orientation. We realize that you rarely totally succeed or totally fail in an effort, and the important thing is to separate out what succeeded, do more, what did not, fix that, and then move forward. And I think that's the spirit we've tried to bring to our participation in this collaboration. We've been in avoidable blindness for the last 2 decades. In 1997, we made a $20 million commitment to the treatment and elimination of trachoma, and we've still been working on that up till today and are looking now at the elimination of trachoma in Mali and close to it in Niger. Since 2013, we've been involved in cataract surgeries, and we've put about $77 million into both trachoma and cataracts over the last 20 years. We're looking for sustainable and scalable solutions. We also give a humanitarian prize in 2010. Aravind in India was the winner of that. We were very inspired by their operation, the social enterprise that makes it possible to offer cataract surgery very affordably with cross subsidies to a wide number of people, and wondered if that might also be possible in Africa. At three important features that I think make this an interesting thing to look at: the willingness of people to pay, the measurable outcomes, and particularly the short period between intervention and ability to determine the success of the intervention. So we were intrigued when we were approached about the DIB idea. In terms of why DIBs, we are looking at them for the same reasons I think that a lot of you would be here in the audience. Low-cost capital to social enterprise, engaging private investors, and for us, shifting our philanthropic work from an emphasis on inputs to an emphasis on outcomes. which also enables us to be very flexible in how those outcomes are accomplished, not just, which is more common in philanthropy, paying for a predetermined fixed set of activities. And we realized that there was significant interest in DIBs, but there weren't a lot of examples. I think you'll hear that today. So we thought that our collaboration with others could help provide information on that. So we're hoping, and I think starting to see the fruits of this effort about developing new models for financing eye care. Thousands of high-quality surgeries, real good for real people in real time. New learning about outcome-based financing, with warts and all, right? What's gone well and what has not, and encouraging multi-stakeholder partnerships. And speaking of that partnership, I would thank exactly the same people that David did, starting with OPIC, the Fred Hollows Foundation, Sight Savers, Africa Eye Foundation, Maghribi Foundation, Netri Foundation, D Capital, and of course, Center for Global Development. It has been an intensive, creative, somewhat transaction costly, but I think fruitful collaboration. And I think we have lots to share today. So for me, this is not the end, but it's a beginning. We put information on the table, we inspire others, we may look for another round and see what we can do. We also hope that although the scale is vastly different, this experience will be helpful on the wider experience of the Sustainable Development Goals, because financing is at the heart of both. And I think you will have a treat today. So thank you very much.
Great. Well, I think as you just alluded to, DIBs are not necessarily the easiest financing models to put together. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, why both OPIC and the Hilton Foundation decided to really look at DIBs as the right model, and why choose this one, I think, is another important question. And so I think I'll start there with both of you. It's like you said, it's costly, it's time intensive, it's not the right funding model for every intervention, and I think that's something that probably will get unpacked a little bit later as well, but really looking at when is it the appropriate financing model, I think is a critical part of this conversation. So maybe we'll start with you, David. Why did OPIC decide to sort of look at DIBs as a financing model, and then specifically why choose this one as sort of the first one to come in as the investor?
Well, as I said earlier, OPIC was founded on innovation, really invented political risk insurance, and continues to innovate the market with new financial products. And when you think about the way we combine investment with advancing development goals, DIBs really falls strictly in the middle of that. To be able to pay for outcomes rather than aid is something that investors have done since the beginning of time. And to be able to put a coalition like this together just made sense. But that said, it's the people like Peter and Dr. Henry and Tamer and others who had the vision to be able to come together. This couldn't have happened any other way, right? I know that people evaluated different countries and different sectors to be able to look at DIBs. But I think you've got here outcomes that are measurable, and you've got a tremendous team that I think is going to be able to implement.
From our perspective, philanthropy is a drop in the bucket in terms of the financing that's necessary for global development in general. So we have to look for ways to attract other capital in. And I think we felt that this was a real promising way to look at. And I should say, I personally should not take credit for any of this. My colleagues Justin and Robert and Shaheen here are the real brains of the operation. I think in terms of why cataracts, we were looking for something that was clearly measurable, that had a binary outcome, works, doesn't work, visual acuity improved, and you can check the next day. That is a somewhat narrow focus, but I think very important for the DIB.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The ability to clearly measure results, DIBs are impossible without that. And so I suppose another question then is how this sort of fits into your broader thinking on sort of innovative financing tools. So at OPIC, you're looking at your strategy moving forward. How does this fit in? Are you actively looking for other DIBs? Are you looking at other instruments that are, going to be able to sort of use your capital to leverage in additional private capital in the way that's probably necessary to meet the goals? How do you think about DIBs sort of in the context of your broader strategy?
OPIC has a $23 billion global portfolio, and it's $7 billion of that in Africa. And not only are we thinking about the ways that OPIC can continue to deploy money to meet sustainable goals, but how we can catalyze more money into the impact sector overall. As I said earlier, I started this journey by thinking about how can capital do the most good in the world. And I got answers that included more energy, site, work in particular regions. But if we can focus on, as a group here and beyond, how we can bring more money into the sector, that's going to be most important. So we're continuing to work at how we can replicate the model of development impact bonds. We're looking at different products that include pooled products and syndicating products and the securitization of products, and we hope to continue to be at the forefront of innovation to bring more capital to advance development goals.
One question that I have for both of you, so you talked about how many billions of dollars are in the OPIC portfolio. This is a relatively small DIB. It's bigger, the first DIB was only $250,000, so it's considerably bigger than that, but it's still a relatively small amount of money. As you look ahead to your investments in DIBs, I think most people who talk about sort of seeing the model expand and grow are saying, we really need DIBs that are investing in 10 million or 20 million. Is that something that either of you are sort of thinking about ahead, as you look ahead, that we need to sort of grow the DIBs that we're looking at?
I would say, and our annual spend is quite a bit less than the billions, but I think we feel a responsibility for experimenting with tools that are scalable. And I think we talked today about the transaction costs involved in getting this off the ground, and they were not inconsiderable. But I think the feeling is that they will decrease as time goes on. I think it was appropriate to start with a modest enough amount of money, but really prove the concept. And that's what we've been trying to do. But we have billions and even trillions of dollars of financing to put together for the whole development agenda. This will not do the whole, but I think it can be a significant part of it.
I think there are different pieces of the puzzle, just as in finance. Venture capital, private equity, and others play an important role in the financial ecosystem. So I think DIBs will play a part of it. I think capital markets will play a part of it. As Peter mentioned, the financing or the development cost of this development impact bond were heavy. But the fact that you've got a cadre of people who understand how it works now and can see the results from that, I think lower the transaction costs going forward here and allow it to be replicated more effectively.
And I guess following up on that, for both of you, what do you feel like you've learned through the process of this DIB that will be helpful either to share, both here with other people who are looking at, putting together DIBs, but also that will inform your own work on DIBs going forward that might reduce those costs of creating the next DIB down the line?
Well, from my perspective, first of all, it's a mindset issue. When we talk about this coalition, I think you're seeing in the field more blended finance where people who wouldn't have worked together earlier are working together. So when you've got some bulge bracket investment firms working with some of the world's great foundations, I think you're more able to channel the trillions of dollars needed for the sustainable goals for the world together. So I think truly just that mindset of being able to work together is new. I was at the Sorensen Impact Conference last week with some of the world's great foundations. And for them to be able to think about starting to allocate their portfolio to more impact investing and more development goals is important. And for them to think about paying for success is important. So every time we tell this story, I think that is equally as important as the outcomes that we're having on the ground.
I think that's right. I think we have collectively a better idea who all the actors are, what their roles are. If you look at philanthropy, you could say it's actually quite high risk because we never get anything back from our grants, right? So, this is actually a step up if we can do it in an actionable way. I think one challenge that is still somewhat open is that it was harder for us to find commercial capital than we expected. And we're really grateful for OPIC for stepping in, but I think we need to keep thinking about that. How much of that is pitch? How much of that is a distance between the rates that capital is looking for and what we might offer? I think we definitely need to triangulate a bit better, but I think we'll be better at that the second time around.
So one question, David, moving forward is whether you see a role where OPIC could come in and help to de-risk that, to help get in more of those commercial investors, where OPIC could help maybe de-risk their investment in future DIBs and maybe come in here. I think you're a pretty high percentage of the total investment amount, but maybe come in at a lower percentage and try to incentivize other sort of private capital to come in along with you.
Absolutely. One of President of OPIC's, Ray Washburn's, highest priorities has been outreach, both in Washington and with the financial community. And we've talked to, you've seen the announcement last week from BlackRock, right? $6 trillion at a time, we're going to start to solve these problems. But truly working with investors to understand what their hurdle rates are, to understand what their risk tolerance is, to understand what asset classes they want to be in. And we are working on new products that intend to catalyze billions, if not trillions of dollars. And it's going to be the capital markets players that are going to help get us there.
Great. And do either of you have sort of tangible plans at this point for other DIBs, or is it sort of like, let's wait and see how this one does, what the sort of results are as we go down the line?
I think we're still in the thick of this one, but I think we are seeing real progress, and the idea that we can get 18,000 surgeries a year, and in a working environment that's not the easiest, I think is inspiring, but we need to digest what it means for our future.
I think there's a lot of courage in this room to be able to replicate this model. So I think as it plays out, it's just been less than a year, right? March 10th or March 7th of last year, we were talking about this for the first time. So I think you get this model right, and then you scale.
Yeah.
Are there other, obviously this targets eye care. It's like a specific issue within the broader, health ecosystem. Are there other specific issues or interventions where you think DIBs are probably going to be the most effective? So as you're, looking forward, or what lessons can you extract? Not only how could we potentially replicate maybe in a different country or another hospital somewhere else in Cameroon, are there other sort of fields where you're sort of looking to see, could we bring together the right group of players to do this?
From my perspective, it's only limited by our imagination, right? To be able to, I think this is particularly well suited for objective early measures. As you said, you can tell the outcome 24 hours later. But clearly, impact bonds on prison recidivism are out there. And people had to think about what that looks like and what the definition of it that is. And as long as people can agree on those objective outcome funding measures, there's no reason why this couldn't be applied throughout the world to any sector.
That's right, and anything that has been the focus of a conditional cash transfer, we probably could do this way as well. Antenatal visits, school enrollment. I think we did deliberately choose something that was very clear and simple to start with, but yeah, I think we can branch out.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both so much. I know we have another panel coming up where we'll go more into the weeds. But first, I'd like to introduce Tamer Makari, who's the Vice President of the Africa Eye Care Foundation and the Executive Director of the Mugabe Foundation, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the role of the Eye Institute, the hospital in Cameroon, which is supported by the Development Impact Bond.
Thank you. So first off, I have to apologize on behalf of Dr. Akif for not being able to be here today. It's been a strenuous couple of weeks for him, and the long-haul travel back and forth to the U.S. and then back to Saudi was probably not the most advised decision to make. And then if I look at it optimistically, he entrusts me enough to be able to speak on his behalf, which is really an honor. He was meant to start with opening remarks, and so if you guys will humor me, I think one of the things that we haven't had an opportunity to do is really celebrate him as kind of the visionary that he is and that I've had the honor of working with for several years now. So I've just prepared a few very quick remarks before we jump into the presentation, which he was meant to give, which I'll give on his behalf. So as many of you know by now, Dr. Akif is the founder and chairman of the Maghrabi Medical Group. It's the Middle East's largest integrated hospital network within the predominantly focused around eye care, and as well as the founder and the serving chairman of the Africa Eye Foundation. What some of you may not know is that he began his life in ophthalmology as a young eye surgeon and practiced well into his mid-60s. He spent tireless hours in the operating theater in what felt like or seemed like a race against time. He took a personally vested interest in the well-being of his patients and every day strived to alleviate the potential pain that would be caused by needless or avoidable blindness. Having now retired, he sees no better way to give back to the industry that he served than to dedicate the rest of his non-surgical career and his personal life to advancing the industry's philanthropic reach and giving the gift of sight to as many people as possible. Throughout his life, he's held strong to the belief that high-quality and accessible eye health care is an ethical imperative applied to every single person, regardless of their race, wealth, religion, legal status. He's never allowed the wealth of an individual to determine his or her level of care. And the interesting thing about wealth from his perspective is that, yes, it can be measured in a number of different ways. Wealth of the heart, wealth of the mind, and obviously monetary wealth. But obviously the latter being the least important and certainly should have no bearing on one's ability to access high-quality medical care. When Dr. Akif embarked on this journey, conservatively speaking, almost 4 years ago, although it's hard to pinpoint time with a visionary like him, he was mentally and physically prepared to see the project through from start to finish, even if he had to do it alone. The need was there, the ambition's genuine, and he understood the trade as both a practicing surgeon and a businessman with 35 plus years of experience in building, operating, and growing a multinational hospital group. And he couldn't have been more certain that things would eventually fall into place. And thankfully they have, because the reality is that although it took a major investment on his part, especially in the early days, he did not have to do it alone. Dr. Maghrabi was accompanied by partners at the International Council of Ophthalmology, his wonderful board of directors, a very committed and well-trained management team, top-notch advisors, pro bono advisors, the likes of Latham and Watkins, his family, and of course our operating partners, which we'll run through in the presentation. This is without question one of the very few truly collaborative eye projects across the globe, and for that, we're extremely proud. Fred Hollow's Foundation, Sightsavers, Netri Foundation, and OPIC, as well as the Center for Global Development, it is with great pleasure that we get to formally welcome you guys to the Africa Eye Foundation family. The money that has been invested will help to improve the lives of thousands, and your collective belief and support is greatly appreciated, and we trust that you will all remain by our side for the rest of the journey through sub-Saharan Africa and knowing Dr. Akif very likely beyond sub-Saharan Africa. Before I begin the overview presentation on the Institute as well, on behalf of myself and Dr. Maghrabi, I did want to thank the Center for Global Development for hosting us this afternoon, and of course OPIC and David to traveling to Yaoundé earlier this month. It's a magical thing when we talk about the size of the loans and how much attention it's garnered. I think the only failure that we could have is if we don't do more things together. So this is very much projected to be. I actually felt bad for the first time not asking for more money after the fireside chat. So lesson note to self. So we'll jump into the presentation, and I think. Just a little test of the clicker. Nope. Nope. Sure, no problem. All right. Great. So just a brief overview on the hospital for those of you that, there's a lot of familiar faces, but for those of you that don't know about the project, I just wanted to run through some of the characteristics of the hospital. I think the most important thing, Maghrebi ICO Cameroon Institute was created by the Africa Eye Foundation as a non-for-profit organization incorporated in Geneva. So the idea is that our incorporation with the Africa Eye Foundation, the strategy is to build a network of non-for-profit subspecialty eye hospitals across sub-Saharan Africa, with Cameroon being our first flagship non-for-profit hospital. It was incorporated in Geneva based on really three tenets: to promote and advocate for better eyesight and the prevention of needless blindness, conduct certified hands-on training courses to equip the Africa eye care experts of tomorrow, and to construct and operate a network of integrated and self-sustainable eye hospitals across Africa, the first of which, as we said, is in Cameroon. And especially what's important and impressive about the hospital itself is that it is now the first ever non-for-profit subspecialty eye hospital in Central Africa. Our aim, our primary objectives with this hospital was really twofold. I think we came to the realization very early on that this wasn't just about service provision, because with sustainability, we always battled with the idea of, well, in order to maintain sustainability, service provision should probably be based on homegrown talent. So the idea was always from the very get-go to incorporate the center of excellence concept and to ensure that doctors were trained from the region in order to service the population that was there, so that we were never reliant on whether it was foreign capital or foreign human capital going forward. Traditionally, a lot of the solutions that we find across areas of need tend to be focused on one aspect of eye care. Nothing pains Dr. Akif more than turning somebody away. So the capability to be able to do everything when it's relating to eye health was something very important. And as you'll see, from a quality standpoint, there are aspects of this hospital that don't exist anywhere else in Africa. In terms of why Central Africa, everybody wants to know kind of the location, and I think one of the most impressive things that I realized with the chairman was a very need-blind kind of assessment of where the required service would be needed the most. And what we found was a very wide gap looking at Central Africa, in terms of population, the pipeline of eye care that would be required going forward. And so it was a very logical region to look at. And then I think Cameroon, in terms of political, business-wise, within the CMAC region, was a very logical place to kind of, focus our efforts, since it was a hub of sorts within that Central African region. Why Cameroon specifically? We talked about the logical aspect from a business and a political standpoint, but it also had its captive demand itself. We're talking about a population of 22.5, I think conservative estimates would say that. Very low cataract surgical rates, cataract being the leading cause of needless blindness, and an incredibly large gap of that continues to grow larger, with birth rates, et cetera. And then in terms of the training for eye care, arguably 1 to 3 ophthalmologists per 1 million people. And even, of those 1 to 3, 25% are working within country, and even of those 25%, maybe none are working outside of urban settings. So outreach component was quite an important aspect. Local political support was really important. It's probably details that we won't get into today, but certainly the government's support of the project was very, very crucial. I think the one really crucial aspect was in terms of, if I highlighted, probably the most important was around waiving customs duties and VATs. because that expedited, again, the sustainability aspect, which is part of the objectives of this development impact bond. Probably saved us about 2 or 3 years, frankly, and then OPIC's investment saved us another year. So hopefully we'll have good news in a year and a half or two. This highlighted the gap that we saw in the market, which everybody knows, but just kind of brings it to life a little bit. There were certainly, the options of low cost, low quality are always there. The options of high cost, high quality is always there. The problem is high quality with affordability doesn't necessarily work. So this was the approach that we looked at. And, keeping in mind that we didn't build a non-for-profit hospital for the poor. We built a high quality hospital for VIP, high quality patients in Cameroon. The idea is that those patients are then used to subsidize the cost of the low cost patients. So in essence, the more competitive we could get on the cost of cataract surgeries, as an example, when we're able to charge VIPs or high-priced, and relatively high-priced, nothing compared to what the US or Europe charges, we're able to do much more of the outreach and poor marginalized surgeries. This just there are 2 points here that I want to make. One on the structure, which we talked about, the cross-subsidization. I think, the free aspect is very related to outreach. There's discounted because, like we said, there's an honor in paying something, and we find that most people want to pay something, and nobody really likes anything for free. And there's something, there's a humanizing the experience is probably allowing someone to pay, not making them take something for free. And then the full pay VIPs, because, like I said, the equipment. I mean, we've got refractive and LASIK surgery, for example, in the hospital, which we won't necessarily extend to wider communities, but people will pay for, and that money and the returns will be used abroad. And then on the offtake, what we found is really interesting aspects with neighboring countries where healthcare is provided, and yet there's an inability to do subspecialties. The idea that, if we look at a neighboring Gabon, for example, to look at creating a primary or secondary hospital to be able to do initial examinations, initial surgeries, and then send subspecialties out to Cameroon so that they're treated. And then the other part of this slide, and I think arguably the most important thing about this project from my perspective, is the impact. So if you look at, conservatively or, realistic estimates around Cameroon, we talk about 525,000 consultations a year within the country. And yet there's only 6,000 surgeries being done a year. So the reality is when someone has a consultation, if they have means, they hop on a flight to Paris. And if they don't, then they let the process of blindness continue. And when you stop and think about the fact that there could have arguably been more surgeries on Cameroonians in Paris than there were on Cameroonians in Cameroon, there's a bit of an audacity in that statement. And when we looked at what sort of impact we could be making with this hospital, we would be talking about doing 1/10 the number of consultations in the entire country. And to give you, I think the estimates were in the first 7 months since opening, we were at 20 to 25,000 consultations. And these are meant to be projections at full scale. So we're doing something right. But then to think that we'd be able to do 2 to 2.5 times the country total of surgeries within country, that's amazing, because that's impact. And that's measurable impact, and that's stuff that we can get really, really excited about. Just to give you a sense of the layout of the hospital, 50,000 square meters, again, granted by the government. It definitely didn't look like this when it was granted by the government. There was a lot of dredging work that was done, and I'll forward kind of quickly through some of the stories just to take you on the quick journey through time. There was issues with the flatness of the land. We had issues with the rainy season and things kind of spilling onto the land. But Dr. Akif just kind of pushed ahead in the very early stages without even government approvals. I mean, it was a Field of Dreams story. If you build it, they will come. And they came. So just kind of fast forwarding through some of the construction. So this was all flat and line, grounds that the group did. One of the best hospital architects globally, one of the best landscapers globally. I mean, the stuff the level of detail that we went into, that Dr. Akif kind of focused on putting into this hospital was really, really quite impressive. And then the inauguration that we had in March of 2017. And then process has begun. I mean, we're seeing patients, like we said, 20,000 consultations in the first seven months. We've launched the subspecialties. We've completed training of doctors. One of the proudest things is that everybody who's working there is from Cameroon or West Africa or Central Africa. So there's something to be said about having a service given by people who are of the same country. It's not really a charity, is it? I mean, it's just improving lives. Down to the details of, I mean, we were finding when we were talking about capital raising, we were literally trying to raise capital for people to just do, you do the children's section, and that's your area. So we were quite specific on the needs. This is an outpatient ward, so this is meant to be, the picture of people that have no means, and yet there's no question about the level of comfort that's being given to people without means. And I remember one of the bigger concerns was, okay, well, it's air conditioned and it's really nice. Maybe people are going to stay for a little longer after their surgeries, but we haven't had any issues like that. Wet labs, one of the things we ran into early on was how do you keep people? How do you keep the doctors? And the reality is doctors want to practice their trade, especially the people that really care about the trade that they're doing and want the outcomes to be delivered. So making sure that we had the level of equipment available for doctors to be able to practice that trade was important. Lecture hall, outreach activities have begun. We see about 300 to 500 people on each outreach. We're usually now looking at a 150-kilometer radius from the hospital to be able to bring people back to the hospital. And now, as an expansion aspect, not only is it growing the campus of the hospital in Yaoundé, but also looking at creating fixed satellite clinics, both in-country and out of country. So looking at, the Northwest region, for example, and other community-based organizations that we can build an investigation aspect and maybe an eyeglass store, and then start to bring patients more proactively rather than just on the outreach side. And this is my favorite slide because I think we got a comment from, it looks like a piece of art. We got a comment from Thulsi, who manages the Aravind program, in one of the meetings that we had very early on with Fred Hollows and Sight Savers and Netri, and he was a little bit in awe at the level of collaboration, because you don't see this quite often in the world of philanthropy. I came out of investment banking. I thought this stuff existed very easily in philanthropy. I think the rude awakening was it doesn't necessarily exist in philanthropy across the zone. But the reality is the level of collaboration that we've had and we've benefited from at different stages when we needed it. I mean, for us, this specific DIB, to keep it focused around this, without kind of, Fred Hollows' visionary kind of stance on alternative financing, at the point where we were struggling from a standpoint of, well, how are we going to accomplish sustainability as quickly as possible? Without that innovative approach, it either would have been, well, let's wait a little longer, or Dr. Akif, we need a little bit more money, which we always try to avoid kind of going forward. So this is kind of the thing that we're really grateful for, and we hope we continue to grow. And this was just the board of directors that's kind of guided the process from here on out. And then just to kind of value proposition from the hospital, because I am a banker, affordable and sustainable surgical pricing model, hands-on training institute and capacity building, subspecialty eye care focus, regional importance and relevance. We have the long-term backing of specialist sponsors, which we want to continue and grow for a very, very long time to come, and strong governmental support and subsidies. Thank you for your time, guys.
Hey. Now I'd like to invite Tamer back, along with the other members of the coalition. We'll be joined by Kirsten Armstrong, who's the Director of Knowledge and Innovation at the Fred Hollows Foundation, and how I first came to know of this DIB. Dia Martin, who was the Managing Director, or is the Managing Director of Social Enterprise Finance at OPIC. Dr. Joseph Oye, who's the Director of the Cameroon Country Office at Sight Savers, as well as the co-chair of the International Agency for the Prevention of Blindness, and Lisbeth Peters, the managing partner of D Capital, and a key player in all of this. Please go ahead and come up. While you're coming up and taking your seats, I just want to say that we're really pleased that we were able to write up a little bit of the lessons that were learned by this coalition of investors. There's really been some great work from our friends at the Brookings Institution. Emily, wave. Yes. I invite you to check out her work. She's looked at really the full complement of impact bonds. In this paper, we are really focused narrowly on the details of preparation. Why is it so hard to get these off the ground? What are the different things that the coalition had to keep in mind and take care of? So with that in mind, I'll leave you to read the paper. It has 9 lessons and something like 25 recommendations. We couldn't control ourselves at the end, but I think some of them will come up in the discussion. So first, I'm going to ask Kirsten, because our first contact was with the Fred Hollows Foundation. And I want to ask you, what is the point of a DIB? You were obviously doing work on preventable blindness for many, many years. Why did you decide to do a development impact bond and get this process started?
The process goes back to, would you believe, 2010. So a long time ago, when the Fred Hollows Foundation commissioned PwC to do a cost-benefit study of, if we were to end avoidable blindness, what would it cost and what would be the global benefits? And we thought it was going to be a straightforward cost-benefit study, but actually it was very good cost-benefit overall. But the reality is that the cost of ending blindness was something that we were quite surprised by, and it made the organisation realise that we had to do something differently. We couldn't just rely on donations and grant funding to end blindness. Mm-hmm. So that was when the foundation started to think about different ways. How could we use health system financing within the countries we worked in differently? How could we use innovative financing to really make a change? So that journey really started way back in 2010.
Great. Okay, so let me then ask a little bit, let me go to Dia as our next respondent, because this is the first DFI-supported DIB. I would have thought DFIs would have been in this space for a long time. Why is this the first DFI DIB?
I would say that at OPIC, we're very excited to support this project. And I think what we saw as OPIC is we looked at the long game. We saw this as something that we could lean into, very strategic. Once we launched this one, we could replicate it, continue to grow with this coalition. And I think that's really part of the story. For DIBs, as has been mentioned before, there is a significant amount of upfront activity that has to take place. And I think that sometimes it could be seen as a deterrent if you're not looking at the long game or the strategy for it. I think from this DIB, we have a lot of lessons learned that we can use as we move forward with different ventures or different products. But I think really that's what it is. I think it was stated earlier, it's really a mind change. And it's learning how to invest with a different lens and with the idea of working collaboratively. And I think even though it may have taken a little bit to get this up and running, I think that this will be the way of the future, and this is hopefully an opportunity for others to come in and invest as well.
So let me ask you, Lisbeth, because one of the things that's interesting about this DIB is normally we think, oh, convincing the donor to do, or the philanthropist to come in as the outcome funder is the main problem. Mm-hmm. In the case of this DIB, actually, it was the upfront investors that were the most challenging to get to invest, even after Hilton and others had signed on, FHF and Site Savers.
Yeah.
Why is that? And also talk to us, in our paper, we looked a little at how the proposed terms of this development impact bond evolved over time, and they got a little bit sweeter over time, I would say. talk to us about that, although not outside of what you see in social impact investing in general. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, but talk to us a little bit about that, Lisbeth.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, the DIB structure as a whole, like always suffers a little bit from its own complexity. Mm-hmm. It's a very complex structure to explain. First and foremost, it's not a bond. So at the opening line of introducing it, you're already one step behind. And then as people wrap their heads around it, you sort of get deeper and deeper into the weeds. As the chart that Tamer just put up, that's a multi-stakeholder coalition right there.
It's a lot.
It's a lot of people, it's a lot of stakeholders, it's a lot of incentives. It's the power of this kind of innovative financing tools. It's all about how to share risks and incentives and how to align the incentives and the impact. Having said that, when you've got all of these players around the table, aligning them takes time.
And indeed, as you said, like before, we saw the outcome funders sort of like struggling to come to the table. I think mostly because of something that David said earlier, which is shifting that mindset from aid to outcome-based and performance-based contracting, or like program, like thinking takes a little bit of time, and there is some industry inertia that one needs to overcome. So we hadn't expected as much, I would say, lead time that was necessary to convince the investors. And I think we noticed a similar kind of like inertia or struggle. The Cataract bond, when we started launching it to investors, was early 2016. It was not the early days of the impact bonds. People were familiar with the concept, but people wanted their cake and eat it too. It was like everybody was like, "Oh, bring me impact bonds. We want impact bonds." And I was like, "Here is one." And they're like, "Yeah, but it's Cameroon. Yeah, but it's eye care. Yeah, but it's avoidable blindness. We like you to do something really more impactful." Like, "Yeah, but it's a metric that is really just one metric. Like we like to see a little bit more of a complex degrading scale." And so everybody came up with something. There was always a reason for. And I think what happened was that we suffered from being early in the market, and therefore there being a discrepancy between reality and what investors were looking, were hoping for. And indeed, like in order to bridge that gap, we sweetened the deal. And it was a pivotal moment, I think, for the entire coalition. It was also a very sort of like disheartening moment to realize that we actually were giving in on some of the equitability, some of the return on impact, in order to be able to add that final piece of the puzzle, which was the investors, to make all of this happen. But I think kudos to this coalition. When we think about what made us get to this point, it's the intangible desire of every single party that you see on that board to do something innovative and to make a difference in recognizing that alone we could come up with something ordinary, but only together we could really create something new and extraordinary.
Well, congratulations. It was hard work. But one has to wonder, are these really impact investors, right? I guess the stereotype that one has is that an impact investor is willing to take a lower level of return in order to get lots of those social goodies. And what we're seeing with some of these early deals is that may not be the case. Maybe we are actually offering about what the market standard is until people get the idea of how this works and that it can deliver. Let me ask you, Joseph, Sight Savers is an organization that's worked closely with the hospitals. You're based in Cameroon. How have you seen this deal develop? What's your perspective on the DIB?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this DIB is unique in that there is a comprehensive way of assessing impact, looking at numbers, quality, sustainability, and also equity. So for the country, it is a project that is very, very important, that will be impactful. Tammy has mentioned the number of expected impacts, but there are other aspects as well. One is that in the developing countries, generally people do not like to go for surgery, eye surgery, just because they know histories of people in their neighborhoods or in their families who underwent eye surgery or who cannot see. But with MySee and the quality that is going to be delivered, that is going to have an impact because people will change their mindset about surgery. That is one thing. The other good opportunity at this point is that the government of Cameroon is very much engaged into innovative funding. And we've just had a pilot performance-based financing project that is now being embedded into the government, and the government is going to become the outcome funder for the performance-based finance. I think this is another model that will also be very interesting to follow for funding of innovative funding. So it's really, really very impactful. And Tema also said that the government really supported it. One, because it is meeting a priority and solving a problem about the number of cataract surgery, avoidable blindness, etc., and also because of the kind of learning that is going to be derived from it, and that is going to actually now be applied back in the whole region. And finally, I would say that economically also, we are hoping, and we've seen that. They was talking about people going to Paris for cataract operations, and we've seen that a number of very highly placed personalities in Cameroon come to the hospital. Personally, I go there quite often. And Henry, Dr. Nkumbe, who is not here, who is a key player, and he's been mentioned here. I also have to actually commend him for his commitment. Has told me, oh, there's a minister in the room, and got a minister from Chad, etc. So that is definitely going to have an impact on the evacuation. And on the other side, the Minister of Health likes to say that he wants to see medical tourism to Cameroon. And we've seen a number of people coming from neighboring countries to Cameroon to come and take the services.
Yeah, that's a great story. Tamara, let me ask you a little bit about this issue. You know, you've shown us the model, which is about cross subsidies. It means that you have to have enough better off clients paying a higher price so that you can subsidize those that don't have an ability to pay. Tell us a little bit about that model, how you expect it to work. Why was financial self-sufficiency built into this DIB? Normally a DIB would only focus on the outcomes, but this actually included, I mean, you had completed the construction of the hospital prior to the DIB being launched, but it didn't have a huge track record of service provision.
Sure.
So talk to us a little bit about that whole process.
Look, I think sometimes when you use, I mean, one aspect of it is when you use the word not-for-profit, everybody kind of loses commercial sense, but we didn't. This was a commercial decision, right? So the fact that there's unmet demand within the market of people across the board, regardless of their wealth background, for quality eye care services in the capital of Cameroon was it's a no-brainer. And from a competitive landscape, there's nothing. So I guess, it's unfortunate that nobody did it from a for-profit standpoint, I suppose. So the idea is, with that, knowing that reality exists from a commercial perspective, and knowing that we could have kind of a first mover advantage, the idea was, well, then it's up to us to do what we wish with the proceeds of that. And I think that's where the idea said, well, it's not commercial ultimately from a bottom line perspective. All we want to do is pump money back into the country, be it, expanding the campus to include, telemedicine and educational facilities, to actually putting our money to work in building fixed satellite clinics across the country to work as referral clinics, or it just means do more outreach and do more free surgeries. I think there's so many options, but the reality that we live in is that every dollar we make in Cameroon will stay in Cameroon. And that's a good feeling. That's something great to say, because commercially it's just a matter of when, not if. And the reality with this DIB is, I think we were looking at a 3 to 5 year horizon, with the advantage of the customs duties being kind of waived on the consumables and the equipment. With the DIB, it kind of expedited that break-even point, which then got Dr. Akif thinking about the next country. So it's a blessing and a curse from my perspective, but certainly useful. And it's a model that works, right? You see Erevan, we've done it in Egypt now, where we do about 7,000 surgeries a year, 60% are free, break-even's around 6,000. Because remember, with eye care, especially when you look at facilities outside of the main hospital, the tertiary hospital, it's 98, 99%, Dr. Joseph can correct me if I'm wrong because I don't know, outpatient, right? So the idea is you don't need all the bells and whistles of a big general hospital. You just need a surgical clinic, trained doctors, and people are out within a day or two, right? So that's a really cool model to start to replicate in other places.
And interestingly enough,
Yeah.
it's something Fred Hollows Foundation is looking to do, as we talked about earlier. Amanda, we've sort of launching a social franchising model that'll see these sort of modest, we call them surgery centres, focusing mainly in Asia, but again, using this, self-sustaining kind of cross-subsidy model. We're doing a pilot at the moment in Vietnam. I was in Vietnam last week, talking with the architect about how we can get a modest size sort of building and convert that into a surgery centre that'll deliver the sorts of cataract surgeries we're doing through the Cameroon model. We've got our first private investor, which is very exciting. There'll be a press release in a week's time, so keep your ears out for that one. And once we've done this pilot to get all the social franchising pieces right, then we think there's a lot of opportunity to bring impact investors in. Again, a different way to bring impact investors into the eye health sector.
And I think just to build a little bit on that, the fact that the metric of operational sustainability and the metric of output and impact are the same, and therefore actually bring together a more traditional financing product, being a loan to a hospital, and the bond structure together, has also allowed a party like OPIC, to use the instruments that they used to use, and tailor it and tweak this and bring this innovative component to it. And I think I would hope, we'll actually convince other investors and private sector investors to come in over time, because the two are 100% correlated and linked.
Yeah. Dia, did you want to?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think for us that was a critical component in our analysis, in the sense that there would be a metric for financial sustainability. For us, it's important as investors to know that the institution would be able to operate on its own and be able to reinvest capital into this hospital or to expand. And that also fed into the strategic view of us being able to do this upfront for this transaction, knowing that we could have a partnership in the future.
If I may just add that that also helps the hospital, or brings them to ensure that their operations are efficient, and also being part of the eye care world, it also brings eye care providers to look out of the usual funders, some of whom are in this room, whereby year after year, some of the NGOs have funded eye care, and it's not in a sustainable way, but being sustainability as a metric will bring the eye provider to first of all ensure that their operations are efficient, so that and then also looking at other ways of financing and looking at other funders as well.
Yeah, just one last comment, because a lot of conversations been had around the size of the bonds, right? But at the end of the day, if $2 million is what's required to take something sustainable, why would I take more? So the argument is, I think that's more a reflection of the project than even appetite from OPIC or Hilton. Maybe we could have gotten more, but could I have rationalized, or could we have rationalized asking for more without bigger plans? Well, we're also piloting the idea in Cameroon. Yeah. So the idea is, I think we were very kind of true to ourselves, and I think that came out with the discussions. This is why, Fred Hollows, Sight Savers, OPIC, I mean, all these groups stayed the course. The Hilton Foundation stayed the course for as long as they did, was because there was something transparent, open, the good, the bad, the ugly, to kind of get it across the line. But the reality is, that's what's necessary. And once we do that, I'd rather go to OPIC and say, we need money for something new, that we need to do. And Hilton Foundation, we'd love more support coming from the perspective of not asking unless I need it, right? And I think there's maybe that's the right way to approach it. I would argue.
Makes sense. Let me ask you a little bit about the arrangements for the monitoring and evaluation of the performance of the bond. We looked a little bit with Roxana Roxam and Lachlan McDonald at the kinds of indicators that were being used by hospital investments in the eye sector, by IFC and some others. And you see metrics like visits. One thing that's quite interesting about the DIB is that it's not just the number of surgeries, it's the outcomes of the surgery, which I think is quite interesting. How will you be assessing that? On what periodicity? When can we have you back to talk about the results?
Yusuf, do you want to go first?
Yes, thank you very much. First thing to say is that the implementer, that is Mise, the hospital, has been part of the project from the outset. So they are actually into the project. And so there's that kind of trust between the investors, the outcome funders, and the implementer. And the other thing is that having the hospital to collect that data is actually bringing the hospital to build their capacity. First of all, to collect useful data for themselves and for accountability, and also to build their capacity in collecting data that can be very complex, because if you look at particularly equity, also looking at the quality outcomes, and finally it also brings a culture of looking at data. Research evidence has shown that if just by monitoring your quality, you see a big leap in a quality improvement. So in this case, they'll be monitoring quality, they'll be monitoring equity, so that will become a culture that is going to be embedded into this service, and which again is going to kind of have an impact on the entire country.
And will there be an external group that validates that administrative
Yes,
data?
exactly. So that's the risk. One of the risks is that there is risk of manipulation, because the implementer is collecting the data. That's why there is an independent monitor to verify this. And also the other risk is that collecting data might become a burden to the facility that can actually have a negative impact on the operations, on the delivery. And that's why we have to look very carefully to ensure that we collect data that is both useful for the implementer and also for verification and for the projects.
Okay. Do you want to say something more about that?
So I think it will be about 18 months. The independent evaluators are now currently working with the hospital and with Dr. Youssef and Site Savers in setting everything up. And then we're going to run the first evaluation. I think the system of making sure that it's embedded within the management of the hospital so that it indeed raises the bar, like at the operational level, is the first layer and the first important mark. Secondly, like as the transaction managers, on behalf of the entire coalition, we will continue to make sure that all of those reports and data are being collected. But I think that the third one, which is independent verification, is really sort of like the key that pins everything together. And that, we should know within 18 to 24 months. And on an ongoing basis in any case, but from an independent verification basis, about 18 to 24 months.
So we'll stay tuned.
Stay tuned, exactly.
Kirsten and Lisbeth, since you were looking at lessons and elements coming from other DIBs and other results-based funding efforts, what would you have included in this DIB that you couldn't include in the end? Or what would you do differently if you had it to do over?
So it possibly goes to your comment, Tamara, and the general discussion about the size of this transaction. I would have loved to have been doing something that was kind of bigger, perhaps across a number of countries. That helps diversify risk a little bit. Instead of just one facility, you may be a number, or maybe again focusing somewhere where there might be a number of facilities, for example.
Yeah.
So that's probably the thing that I would have liked to have seen is a bigger, and the early advice that we got was that because of the transaction costs involved and the effort and energy, aim for something about 10 million. But I think, given that this is an early, this is a new market, bringing in more, parties into something as complex as this, I think it was just going to make things even more and more complex. And we knew at the outset, we've been sort of, I guess a driver trying to bring people together around this concept. We knew at the outset that it was going to be, a challenge, and we needed to have the right people, around the table discussing things, and I think we were talking over lunch today, I think that, I've been waking up to, Thomas and Elena once a week from UK, and Robert and Justin from Hilton Foundation have been going to sleep with me once a week as well, just over the phone. So, having a coalition that you can talk around is so.
This was really a global DIB. Global DIB. And maybe asking you before you answer that also, how would this apply to other global health? One of the interesting things about eye care, for good or ill, many times it's not covered in a publicly subsidized set of services that are currently being provided for a number of reasons. There are other kinds of things like that. Dialysis comes to mind, surgery comes to mind. Can you reflect a little bit about, is a DIB, of course they don't have as nice outcome measures, as verifiable outcome measures as the ability to see you know. But obviously we have stuff in the armament that we could use. But can you reflect on that, Lisbeth, and also say what you were going to say before I interrupted you?
Oh, you mean on the usability
Yes.
of applying this kind of instrument?
Yeah.
I think the 2 or 3 things that make interventions like cataract and dialysis and others, like useful is one focused metric, that you can point to and you can quantify it, but that it's an outcome metric rather than just an output metric, I think is absolutely key. I think the other one, which is interesting you mention it, we feared and something that we would have done differently probably in pitching, like to what David was saying earlier, to pitch to the investors. Like you said, there is a number of impact oriented parties that care more about other topics, like things that are more difficult and sort of like avoidable blindness. Well, it's avoidable. It's sort of like, it's a little bit of an orphan, like of the aid industry, but it actually makes it a prime target for private sector impact investors. And in our pitch, we didn't necessarily see that angle. And we didn't sort of like point to, like here is why, like from an economic point of view, like this therefore sort of like makes sense, and you're building the healthcare system with that. And I think dialysis, certain other treatments, like actually that are at the root of building a primary healthcare system that is ultimately, like more longer term and sustainable. We've got the Abrash Fund for Health in Africa, like that is sort of like at the commercial side of that. You've got the Aga Khan Foundation with their cancer and oncology centers. There is way more, like that we as an impact investing community can do by replicating a model like this, whether you tweak the instrument, whether you tweak the coalition, whether you tweak the intervention, like that actually doesn't, like matter too much.
Yeah, and Tamara and Dia, that where you're looking at other countries, you're looking at investments like this every day. The data, I would guess, on deciding whether one of these things is going to be profitable, whether it would even enable a cross-subsidy scheme in the way that you have set out here, it requires that cases are diagnosed, that you would know about them, that there would be demand that was effective, that you could do that scale and price. I mean, how do you, when you look at these other opportunities, either in your own narrow sector of eye health or otherwise, what do you see? I mean, what could we be doing in the civil society, academic, technical assistance space to ready those providers for these kinds of operations?
I think it's been touched on before. There are a few specific points. One, I think, Lisbeth, you said it excellently, to tell the story. So to understand all of the components and how they work together, I think it's very important when you approach investors to be able to do that. And what does it mean to tell the story? I think with this coalition, it was very interesting and unique and exciting for us to know that we had someone like Dr. Mugrabi, who had been able to be successful using this model in other countries, doing this in Cameroon. When we looked at the story behind the outcome funders, we saw that each outcome funder was very unique in their own right. We had site savers on the ground. We had Hilton Foundation with their strategic focus. We had Fred Hollows that was really leading kind of that advanced, way of looking at financing these types of transactions. And even as we talked to the transaction manager, their experience in DIBs and the work that they've done over the years. So for us, I think the way I would answer that question is we want to look at each component of the coalition and make sure they have the ingredients for it to be a successful transaction. And once we're able to uncover that, then we could look at what's the data, what will we measure? And that's something that I think is more of a conversation about what works and what's more flexible, but having that core team in place that we believe can execute as an investor is of the primary importance.
I mean, Tara, you're building stuff. I mean, do you think, should you be buying other hospitals, as you see other people in these spaces?
I mean, buying, or should we be collaborating more with existing, there's an opportunity obviously to acquire and make something better. There's, in Egypt, bizarrely enough, there was probably the largest infrastructure of government-owned eye hospitals, from the colonial period. And, Egypt embarked on a process where there was amazing equipment that just wasn't being used, so how do we reshuffle and reorganize? But again, you need that labor workforce, so I think the training element, I think when we approach these, we try to think of it from an OPIC or DIA's perspective of saying, well, what other things can we tee up? And obviously, the training element and the homegrown element is something that sat very important to us ethically and also from a sustainability standpoint. I think the two other aspects that we looked at were, there's some absolutes. So if you're going to pick eye care and you say, okay, is the demand there? Okay, well, the highest prevalence of needless blindness is in sub-Saharan Africa. So you're not going to get it wrong there, because if it's not there, then we can argue about other places, but it's there. And that kind of takes the guesswork from an investor standpoint. I think the other thing that I think we tried to articulate, but maybe not effectively enough, because Dr. Akif is by nature quite humble. It's not really a story if you're not investing in the Middle East as a Middle Eastern investor to run around saying, look what I'm doing in Africa when there are problems in the Middle East. Is this isn't a greenfield. Like this is a visionary that's built the largest chain of family-owned eye hospitals outside of India. So it's sitting at 40 plus commercial hospitals, and it's not a public company, so I won't talk about the revenues or whatever, but it's profitable. It gives Dr. Akif enough to be able to do these sorts of projects. And I think that's something, we're really delighted with this first one, because then we can say, well, we've done it. So we don't have to say, well, there's a group in the Middle East you may or may not have heard of. They've got 40 hospitals. It's a private company, but believe me, they really do have 40 hospitals. So I think that's the other aspect that we would try to kind of articulate a little bit more kind of going forward, which should give comfort to the investors.
Yeah. You can do bottom of the pyramid too?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. So now we can turn to the audience for your questions. Please say who you are, where you're from. And we'll collect 3 questions, and then we'll go back to the panel.
My question is, I think I understand the bond structure. The bond issuer was the Eye Institute, or the borrower lenders, or the bond holders, or OPIC. How did OPIC price your capital? Because I see the 840, so triage of return. Was your risk assessment made public, so because most commercial banks don't know how to assess the success of eye surgery. I mean, this is really a performance bond, if you were calling it a bond.
Let's collect another question back here, Louis.
Thanks, Amanda. Louis Borston from the Osprey Foundation. If somebody had told me that Hilton Foundation was involved with this, I would have thought they were not actually the pay and performance. I would have thought they had invested in the riskiest part of it, which is the front end. And so I'm curious why it was structured this way, and whether there was an opportunity to take organizations that might take more risk and have them do the upfront investment, and then find other people to take the back end, which is really, I mean, once the performance is assured, there's not a whole lot of risk there.
Yeah. Third question. Mead?
This is fascinating. 20 years of experience at the World Bank led me to believe that one thing that one should stay away from completely in any type of conditionality arrangement between a donor and a recipient is a high stakes threshold. A high stakes threshold is if you hit, your target, you get full payment. If you're 1 unit short, nope, sorry, no payment. And I understand you have a buffer, but that doesn't convince me, because that means if you hit within the buffer, you get full payment. If you're 1 eye surgery short, nope, no payment. So our experience at the World Bank was, as soon as you have a high stakes threshold, it never works. And the reason it doesn't work is that nobody can live with it. Neither the donor nor the recipient can handle the fact that you're only a few eye surgeries away. So instead, what CGD is frequently, I'm a senior fellow here at CGD, what we frequently recommend is that it's a unit payment. So you take the same money, but it's totally linear. For every additional effective, high quality surgery, you get an additional amount of money without any high stakes threshold. So I'm wondering if you're, why isn't that mentioned, and why haven't?
Okay. Why not? Why not progress and instead of thresholds? Okay, so let's start the question about how to assess risk. Dia, do you want
Sure,
to?
I'd be happy to take that question. So first I will mention that this loan would be, or this DIB would be through our Portfolio for Impact program. That's a program that OPIC set up in 2014 where we can lean in and we can do more earlier stage high impact investments. So in that program, we look at transaction size 1 to 5 million. So I want to first put that there as the lens from which we view this investment. It's within this portfolio where we understand these are earlier stage, higher risk projects. We did a complete credit analysis or assessment. We looked at the hospital's operations to date. We definitely look at the Mugabe's hospitals and centers, their track record in the Middle East. We also looked at the outcome funders because that is a very critical part of our ability to get repaid. So it was a very thorough, comprehensive credit analysis on the merits of the transaction and our ability to get repaid in itself. When we looked at the interest rate, as Lisbeth mentioned, there was definitely some back and forth, and we wanted a rate that we felt was commensurate with the risks we were taking. So that is definitely factored in there. We did want to have some flexibility because we understand this is a very innovative structure and there's a lot of risk within that in itself. But it was very much kind of focused on OPIC's typical operations and what we consider to be commercial or fair rates.
Maybe I'll ask you, Kirsten, and then Lisbeth, and maybe we'll invite our colleagues from Hilton to comment on the role of philanthropy and really what party here should take the biggest risk.
It's interesting actually because even in this transaction, in a way, the role of the Fred Hollows Foundation is a little unusual for us. So we would normally operate as a program manager, being responsible for delivering stuff on the ground. Sightsaver's very similar in that sense as well. So we've taken a slightly different role in this transaction. So we're also acting as outcome funders. And I think, from my perspective, and I think it's worthwhile, discussion with Conrad Hilton, their choice. But from our perspective, it was partly we at the time felt that the biggest challenge in bringing together a development impact bond was actually having clarity about how the outcomes were going to get funded when they happened. And we thought once you had clarity that there was an outcome funder, you knew who that was, you had confidence that they would pay that money on outcomes, that actually it would be easy to bring an investor in. And actually we didn't find that to be the case. We found it harder than we thought. So that was part of the reason for structuring that way. I think that in terms of why was it challenging to bring an investor in, my own observations is perhaps we should have had someone as part of the journey in the consortium to start with. I've seen them, social impact bonds work that way. So, there's a few lessons for us in that.
Tamer, actually, you talked about maybe, wouldn't it be a good idea if philanthropy were using its endowment, actually, or program-related investments to do this kind of thing rather than serving as outcome funders, or both?
Yeah,
even,
I mean, we've seen. I've had the privilege of serving on some family endowment boards who are trying to align their grant-making policies with the management of their endowment. So it's almost double impact and sometimes larger impact, because you can look at groups that have a $100 million endowment and say, well, we do 5% of our endowment investments a year, so we'd like a 5% return from the market. Great, but you've got $100 million that needs to be managed, whether it's publicly or privately. So we see kind of that trend and that movement and interest from family foundations that may have a very focused, localized process for grant giving, but from an endowment, they'll invest in global multinationals. So they don't have the same restrictions that exist. I just also wanted to add on the question that the gentleman made about kind of the risk. Just so we cut through kind of all of it, I mean, there was a foundation that took the first step, and it was the Mugabe Foundation of an investment of 60% of the $10 million that went into this. The challenge that we've had, and while it sounds great and everybody wants to say that they'd be the first to move, is find me foundations that want to pay for brick and mortar, because that's not performance. So, and the scary thing when we relate it again and bring it back to eye care is, fine, we're sitting in a privileged situation where at least cataract is the leading cause of blindness, which can be outreach and innovations around bringing people to a localized area to do the surgeries. When it's diabetes, that's a whole nother story. And then people are going to be begging for cash for infrastructure, which isn't going to be there. So I think that's a challenge that we're not quite at yet. And it's a conversation. We always talked about keeping the core team together because I want to remove all the other uncertainties. So it's a conversation where it's with an OPIC and with a Hilton Foundation say, I realize you don't, but how can we make this work? Do we extend the tenor? Do we, do we make this? So I think that's an interesting conversation to be had. But we probably had to further this from a principle standpoint a lot farther than many people. We always say, is it replicable? It depends how many Dr. Akifs are out there, right? Because there was a big investment to get it to that stage to then say we now have something that's capable of taking a performance bond structure. But that was our biggest challenge kind of going into this from a financing perspective.
I think just to add one more thing, because I wholeheartedly agree with Kirsten and Tamer, is that even though the investors are the upfront risk takers, there is the guarantee sitting behind it from the outcome funders. So actually the party that is taking the most risk in the entire transaction are the outcome funders. Yeah. So even in the success scenario. And I think we should not forget that.
Yeah, we should talk a little bit about this visualization of the outcome, the success scenario and the failure scenario. And it's a little bit related to the question that Mead is posing about a high stakes threshold. From an outsider's perspective, it looks like you were very confident about meeting those goals. But we did talk with Hollis at the start of this about, and with Hilton about pay per unit versus a threshold. Tell us a little bit about why you settled on the threshold instead of pay per unit.
I think possibly going back to the core of your question, it maybe isn't as steep a cliff as you describe. So the difference in outcome, for example, or difference in return for OPIC is the difference between 8% and 4%. The biggest impact in terms of who funds that return is actually the impact between the outcome funders and the hospital. So if that cliff happens, if there's a failure scenario, then 25% of the principal is repaid by the hospital and not by the outcome funders. So it is a cliff, but I think perhaps not as steep as might have been described. And I think it's a mixture of having a different range of outcomes, not just numbers, but also quality, equity, and sustainability. Means that actually you need to sort of put together not just an output-based result. And probably just one more thing to add to that is the outcome funders have, had the discussion that, should the hospital get close, then, while the rules of the contract say this is what we're up for, we're committed to actually making the hospital work. And we're happy to have that conversation about supporting it where appropriate beyond the official contractual terms.
Keep that inside.
Oh, we've already told you.
Yes, just to support what you just said is that looking at the outcomes, there's a combination of outcomes that might not be easily applied if you're looking at unit costs. For example, if you look at quality, it says at least 50% of people who have been operated have a good outcome by WHO standards a day after surgery. And then you also look at equity, where you say, okay, the same percentage of the poorest two quantiles, which is 40% in Cameroon, should receive services. So when you have that kind of combination of complexity of outcomes, might not really be easy if you just look at the unit cost.
And but one thing just to say is that this is a bond that has been, it has had a few outcome measures, which I think is also a good thing, because some of the other DIBs you see with many, many outcome measures, although you're right that there's the three big ones plus financial sustainability, it's sort of 4 better than 25, right?
Yeah.
So It's hard to get to one, is the bottom line.
And I think to the earlier point, like this is an effort of a coalition where the inclusiveness of every single decision, like has been made collectively with all of the different parties. And I think yes, like we've already transparently built in that if there were a situation where like we need to get back to the table and sort of like reassess, like if we get into that gray zone of like the outcomes are not being attained or this or that. The spirit of the coalition is like we'll get back to the drawing board and we'll like get back together and we'll figure this out. I think one other thing that I would add is that even though this is not a greenfield from an experience point of view, it is a new operation, and so there is somehow a balance that you need to strike between this being a debt investment or sort of like a like if it's a unit payment, like one could, in terms of a repayment schedule, it marries more a loan rather than an equity investment. And so in a way, like if you look at how the hospital will operate and get out of its J curve, like you sort of like need to give them that time, like to get to that point and beyond that point of EBITDA sustainability, and then everything sort of like starts rolling. And so the way that we structured the outcome targets are reflective of that journey that the hospital needs to get through.
And I would just second that, because that was very important to us because it impacts our return as an investor. So understanding how those outcome targets would be reached, what the timing is, if there had been any sensitivity or some sensitivity to that was important to us. And we were able as investors to get comfortable with the outcome metrics that have been proposed.
Yeah, I think there are 2 points that I wanted to add, because we talk about we always like to think kind of positive about even the high threshold aspect. And while there is, the risk of maybe a linear relationship with the number of surgeries could have been better, it's important in the spirit of transparency to say, well, assuming we achieve the objectives of the threshold that we've identified, there's also a bonus for the hospital to be able to. So that's the way I look at it, from the how can I get more, not, oh, I'm going to hit this, I'm not going to hit this. And then because we looked at this from a commercial standpoint, it was a very unapologetic conversation in terms of if we don't hit those numbers. We talked about numbers of 12 to 15,000 a year, full-scale operations. If we can't hit 18,000 in 5 years, we're not going to be sustainable. We should go do something else. It did fail, and I'd rather know that in 5 years and do something else than continue a broken model. So I think there's just some honest introspection in terms of are we able to achieve these numbers or are we not? And it sat very well. And we talked about it over lunch. We never, this sustainability was not something pushed on us. It was something that we wanted to do from the very beginning, and we understood that it was very important to Fred Hollis, to Sightsavers, to OPIC, to the Hilton Foundation. Otherwise, why would they be interested? We would have gotten no one if that wasn't kind of an interest from that standpoint. So I think it's important to show kind of the positive element of the bonus structure, which is what we're aiming for, and then the aspect that sustainability was an unapologetic conversation for all of us around the table.
No, I think maybe kind of like as a last reflection, I think from a conceptual point of view, I completely see, like the argument behind the question. And I would say this doesn't necessarily work for every DIP or every DIP solution. I think every DIP in that sense needs a customized, bespoke way of looking at these things and deciding and designing. And to Kirsten's point earlier on, it's where we had all of the parties at the table that we came up with like the final set of how it was all going to look.
Let's take 3 more questions. Go ahead.
Hi, I will start by giving you credit for the project. Both my grandparents were blind. So a little bit too late for my grandparents, but good job. I had 2 questions in terms of the sustainability of the fundings of the organization. So I heard the gentleman say that one of the methods he had in order to sustain the cost of care was to have the rich basically subsidized for the poor. Now, knowing the field in Cameroon, how would you be able to identify the rich and the poor? Because it's extremely tricky. The rich in Cameroon were easily identifiable, about 5 in Yaoundé, for example. So how would you do that?
Yeah.
And my next question would be in terms of management. So it's been studies have shown that healthcare systems in developing countries do not have great results because, unfortunately, health practitioners, doctors, assume the role of managers of health organizations, and they do not necessarily have the experience or background. They're great at operations, but not necessarily management. Now, for this organization, how is that problem, approached?
Yeah.
And
that sounds good.
I know that as of now, Cameroon does not have a healthcare administration program. Okay.
Learn by doing.
And if OPIC is here, it could be a good project to work on. Just saying. Cameroon does not have a health administration project. Are the administrators of this organization going to come from the US? Or where are their administrations going to come from? Or are they going to be health practitioners assuming the role of administrators in this organization?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Another question? Thoughts?
The hospital in Cameroon is private, and what's your thinking about the prospects of such a loan to the public sector, where there's much less control over the human resources, hiring and firing, and then the finances and retaining the finances? And then secondly, in our experience, a lot of the hospitals, hospitals and clinics in the world, are much, much, much smaller. And they really only need financing to be able to make a leap to be able to achieve their real ability. But it's really an amount of like $200,000. And they need to be able to access that money within 6 months and not 2 years of due diligence. So that's, from our feeling, that's where a lot of the the trick would be to figure out how can we do that through a process like this.
Okay, and Ellie?
Hi, Emily Gustafson, right from the Brookings Institution. So first of all, congratulations to all of you, and also congrats to CGD for a great report. Super important to get all of this information out there, and for you guys to be so honest about it, so that's great. So my question is, one of the biggest things that's said about impact bonds is their ability to improve performance management. And I've heard a lot about the upfront capital commitment need here. But not so much about kind of how does switching from input-based financing to outcome-based financing improve the ability to achieve those outcomes in this case.
Okay, great. Okay, so a rich set of questions. So why don't we start with Joseph, with the last question maybe. You were there working with the hospital management. Well, you could also address the issue of management.
Yeah.
But why don't you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, maybe we'll start with the issue of management, to say that in this particular case at the MISE, there are two people in high-level administration. You have a medical director who looks mostly at medical technical issues. Then you have a sort of administrative director who looks at the administration in this particular hospital. And also there is the executive committee that is going to play a role of oversight and also coordination. There will be regular society savers, Fredolos, the Hilton Foundation will be doing oversight and then also doing that. But I do agree with you that in the system, in the particular government system, doctors who are not trained in administration are given administrative responsibilities in the hospital, which is certainly an issue. But in this particular case, we don't really have that risk. And now talking about input funding versus performance, I think is an interesting debate. As I said earlier, we're just completing a pilot project with the World Bank on performance-based financing. And overall, it was successful, and then the government is actually embedding outcome or outcome funding within the government. There will be a unit within the government that is going to be doing buying outcomes, and also there will be a process for independent monitoring of performance in the system. So I think one of the issues that people have raised about the performance-based financing is the input side of things, because performance-based financing will only look at the performance, but then you need all sorts of resources to be able to deliver quality. So that's one of the issues, and really I will see this other way of funding as sort of complementary, and it's important that the government, if we look at it and dream that in a way that the government is now embedding performance-based or performance financing into the system, the government will also embed inputs, because really both are important. So that's what I say. Now about the private and public services. I think I've said that a bit when I said that government is actually now integrating performance-based financing within the ministry, and this is another experience. And Tema said it, the government of Cameroon is very, very much committed to this project. And there is an agreement that is signed between the government and the hospital, which has a number of commitments. And one of the commitments from the hospital is actually to ensure that there's training, and also that the learnings from these hospitals, or this hospital is actually embedded into the wider health system. So it is possible that this will impact the public service as well. And in Cameroon, again, right now the government is working on a universal health coverage scheme. And I think this is also a very good opportunity for us to be able to embed something like this into that.
Mm-hmm. So, Tamara and Dia, so you're the external investors. Mm-hmm. You're going to bring that famous private sector discipline and watching the performance. How would you characterize this as different from an operation where you're financing the inputs versus paying out or having money riding on the outcomes?
Yes, so first, I definitely would like to answer that. But first, I would say I wanted to address the gentleman's question on SME financing and being able to get loans quicker than 2 years and 6 months. At OPIC, we have a very kind of large portfolio for SME financing. As a matter of fact, one of our other projects is the Medical Credit Fund, where we provide financing to SME healthcare clinics across sub-Saharan Africa. So I just wanted to address that before I forget.
They're here too.
Oh, yes, John Simon here? Oh, perfect. There, great. So you'd be a great person to talk to, and we're very proud of that project. But to get back to your point, on all of our transactions, and specifically the transactions within the Portfolio for Impact program, we look at concrete measurements that we measure on a quarterly basis. So we're going to be looking at the hospital's performance from day one. We have a very extensive quarterly report that we have with several KPIs for the hospital. And this will be a conversation we have if we see there's a lapse or we see there's an issue. It's not something that we would wait until year 3 to address. We would address it right after that quarter. So that's the first thing. We're going to have continuous monitoring on a regular basis. The second thing, as I mentioned, as part of our due diligence process, one of the things we looked at is capability. Do we believe this team has the capability to meet these targets or to meet these measurements? And if we didn't believe in the management team and the equity investors in the hospital, then we would not have moved forward with this deal. And that gets to the young lady's point. One of the things that was very important to us from day one is there a distinction between the operations management of the hospital and the provision of medical services? Because we want it to be done in a way that the medical staff could concentrate on excellence, having medical excellence. So in our mind, the way we do it is upfront, we do a due diligence of capability, and then there is a continuous monitoring process. And this goes for all of our loans, but specifically in this case, we're going to monitor the social and the financial performance of the hospital on a regular basis.
Yeah, and just to kind of add, and just to remind us kind of why we got into all this work in the first place, appreciate you sharing kind of that about your grandparents. And I think the reality is, when you then rewind 70, 80 years and you say, well, now you've got a child who didn't live a fulfilled life like your grandparents, and for $20, for $30, for no money at all, you save an entire life and the related life of the burden that causes. So I think that's really what brought us here, and the tangibility of these outcomes is what really makes, what's exciting about a bond like this. It's a yes or no. It's I see or I don't. And it's a race against time, right? Because the need is there, and we can't rely on governments to do it. There's a burden on us as people to be able to extend that. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, and I appreciate kind of, that openness from your side. I think with us, again, if I look at it from a commercial standpoint, I want OPIC and the Hilton Foundation to create a system of more accountability. I want the bar to be raised to make it harder to get traditional grant money, because I think if you're asking for money, you should have a level of accountability. So I don't think that's an apologetic aspect, and I think where we start to see the commercial world entering the philanthropic world and taking those commercial ideals into that, that's not something I think that large family foundations or financiers like OPIC need to apologize for. I think if the people that are requesting the money are actually asking for that, then everybody will kind of join the trend. And I think that will start to unlock some of this DIB financing and some of the performance-based issues. And the one thing that the DIB does for us, obviously, that the performance-based doesn't, which Joseph rightly hit, is just working capital, right? So great, okay, I'll come to you when I do this, but how am I going to do that, right? I need some capital up front. So I think it's just a maturity of all kind of players. And then the other thing is, it's effective philanthropy has been driven by focus. So when you look at the Gates Foundation and you say, well, that's synonymous for vaccines. There's a reason we're not into primary care, because they're tackling effectively vaccines. But as those models develop, not the problem solved, but as the template's been created and it can automatically run itself, then you'll see interesting kind of movements from groups like that to say, okay, now let's look at primary kind of care as well. So it's an interesting kind of development from that standpoint.
Yeah. How do you figure out who's rich and who's poor?
Yes. Oh yeah.
Who gets the VIP price?
Yes. That is. Thank you for that. How do you figure out when the hospital offers a range of services, from sort of VIP to I would say standards, but by no means low quality. And the services, VIP services, actually charged, in a way that is going to subsidize the standard services. My colleague Thomas was telling me about there is a room, it's called a presidential suite in that hospital, where you've got a very nice room, secretariat, bathroom, etc., very posh, but then you pay for it. So if you pay for it, then that's going to subsidize the other. So how do you distinguish that? One is when you give the offer, usually people who can afford it will pay. And in the experience of that hospital, you see that a number of people, ministers, directors, etc., actually come into that hospital, and there is a VIP service where when you receive those kind of people, you just take them to the VIP corridor, and then they get their service there. And now, how do you verify that? There is the equity tool that is going to be applied there. There are statistics that are generated yearly on the quantiles of society in Cameroon, and that is going to be, the equity tool is going to be applied in the hospital to see to it that everybody, all the quantiles are covered, and that particularly that we have at least 40% of the lowest quantiles that are covered by the service.
And you could probably imagine that the government, as it expands, if all goes well, and there's growth and there's more budget, that they might subsidize the poor as part of a universal health coverage scheme,
Yes,
right? Especially if you have that
this
specialized
is
facility.
this is an opportunity, really, because the government is right now working on that universal coverage, and it's really an opportunity. And given the commitment of the government to this project, I think will be something that will be easy to do. Yeah, possible. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, the reality, just so everybody has kind of the right contextualization on this, because there's always a concern, you know, people are trying to get across the system, I'm poor, I need a cheaper surgery. The reality is people with means don't want to be sleeping in an outreach, you know, facility with 65 other beds, so they'll pay for the service that they get. So it's a very commercial decision and it works, but also don't forget that, you know, Aravind, which is kind of the godfather of this market, was kind of a volunteer pay system, right, and survived. So that was people donating, not just subsidizing, but proactively saying, I am a person of means, you know, here's the money that we'll pay for somebody that doesn't have. So there's good in humanity, right? So it's not that we think that everybody's going to cheat the system and say, well, I'm going to show up with raggedy sweatpants and say I need a $40 surgery. So I think that's the reality that we're dealing with, and we found the same thing in Cameroon. People with means they have means and they're proud of what's been done.
Just last week I was talking with Dr. Henry Nkumbe, who is the medical director. It was actually related to me that there are a number of people who have already come forth to say, okay, I'm going to subsidize. And he specifically mentioned a friend of his who gave 1 million CFA just to say, okay, here's 1 million, can you give service to those who and so the discussion was that because I don't know if you're Cameroonian, but in Cameroon, the issue is trust, really. People don't trust their money into other people's hands. So if we put, and I was discussing with Henry, Dr. Nkumbe, if we put set up a system where there is transparency, traceability, and recognition in kind of this kind of philanthropic donations, and I'm sure that in Cameroon you'll see a lot of it coming forward.
And we manage, I think another thing, Dr. Joseph, that you've seen with the hospital is we've closely managed the flow. So the back office, if you will, the surgeries are the same quality regardless of the means. But the patient populations don't necessarily intersect, right? So I can go as a person of means, I'm going to a high quality hospital. What I do with my profits, my business. So as long as I'm paying what market's paying, then if I use it to subsidize the poor, that's a decision I make as an institution. Now, I don't know many people that would say, now don't put the profit that you've made to helping my fellow countrymen. There may be people like that, and maybe they won't be out there, but I think the solution works for the larger majority of people that go in and say, and then when they know that it's a non-for-profit, then you do get these, you know, amazing gestures of people saying, well, hold on, you know, here's what can you do with another million Cameroonian francs.
It's interesting actually that it's a not-for-profit hospital, and that makes it a little bit different also from other DFI investments in this space. Okay, so we're at time. I want to thank the coalition members and you, the audience, that have accompanied us on this journey, and wish you best of luck in implementation, and hope that we can have you back in 18 to 24 months. Stay tuned.
Asking for $10 million.
That's all. And we have a reception actually out in the back, so please don't leave without the all-important celebratory beverage of your choice. Thanks.